Miss Fraser-Butlin, how does our next witness wish to be known?
She wishes to be known as Joanne.
Joanne. Could Joanne please come forward?
Please state your full name. Take the book in your right raised hand and repeat after me. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that the evidence I shall give
that the evidence I shall give
shall be the truth,
shall be the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the
and
truth.
nothing but the truth. Okay. Lucille.
Did you want to sit with Joanne? Please do. Joanne, you're here to give evidence about your late husband, Keith.
I am.
And you met him in 1980 and married in 1983.
We did.
Can you tell us a little of what Keith was like?
When I met him, he was very conservative.
Joanne, I'm just going to stop you. Would you mind coming a little bit closer to the mic so that everyone else can hear what you're saying as well?
He was quite a conservative, cautious person. Was getting himself back on track with his education. Was doing a bachelor degree. Was very excited to be part of the student community in Sunderland. And lived with 3 other lads who were students with him, who played cricket down the hallway in their student digs. Older, a mature student, but still one of the lads.
You're very softly spoken, Joanne, and I'm conscious that lots of people want to hear what you're saying, so if you can keep your voice up, that would be
Right,
great.
I'll try.
Keith had severe haemophilia A, and from the 1970s you understand that he received factor VIII.
He did.
But you recall living a normal life of camping, seeing friends and going out despite Keith's haemophilia?
Yes. We did a northern tour of northern Europe before we got married, visiting Germany, Holland, Liechtenstein, and enjoying some of the other cultures that we came across, yes.
Keith was infected with hepatitis B, hepatitis C and HIV. Can we start off in relation to the HIV? Can you tell us how you came to find out that Keith had been infected with HIV?
It was during 1984, after we were married. We'd moved down south, and Keith had started a wonderful job as a lecturer. And towards the end of 1984, he lost an awful lot of weight. He was a very small-framed man, so to lose over 2 stone was quite a lot. We were very worried, and at the time there were news stories in the distance about this new HIV/AIDS. Didn't know a lot about it, but we'd already connected with the haematology group in Addenbrooke's Hospital. So we knew a little bit. We went back to the consultant, reported the weight loss, and coming up to Christmas she said, well, why don't you go and have a test? So we did, and we didn't get the results till the following year.
And how did you receive those results?
Just after Christmas, we received a letter with AIDS, don't die of ignorance, franked on the front of the envelope. And I knew what it was. It had come from Addenbrooke's. So I left Keith to open the envelope. It was his mail. I was there, but quietly sort of let him open the letter himself just after Christmas.
And how did you both feel when you opened that envelope?
Keith cried, very worried, didn't know what that meant, because there wasn't a lot of information around at the time. I was very confused. Things were going well in our lives, and especially for Keith. Pulled himself up by the bootstraps and got himself off to college, got himself married, and got himself a job as a lecturer, something he'd always dreamed. He dreamed for normality, and I dreamed for a man who would compliment me. I was very flighty, very busy, active in church, and Keith was, like I said, very conservative, so we both met and complimented each other. But I was very confused. What did it mean? What would happen? All of these thoughts run round your head, and there was nobody there really to answer, especially for Keith, what it would mean.
How do you feel about having been told that information by post rather than face to face?
At the time, we didn't really think anything of it. We just expected, yes, you'll be all right, tick the boxes, you'll be fine, move on. But actually, with the news that it bore, it would have been very, very helpful if someone who knew about the situation had been there to actually say, we're there for you, we're there with you, we'll help you through this, we'll on top of the medical profession, we'll find out what we can bring you, how we can mend this. But it was very quiet time of no support really, not knowing what does it mean, who do we share this with, what do we do.
You then did have some consultations with the treating doctor.
We did.
Were you provided with much information at that stage?
No, there were no leaflets, pamphlets, books, because it was early in the history of AIDS in this country. So I know Dr. was a very caring person, and she said she was very helpful, and would have said, you know, we'll do what we can. I was tested. She did mention that we should take precautions as a married couple, and I was adamant that this was my husband. I wasn't going to treat him any differently. I wasn't going to wear rubber gloves or anything else. We were going to have a relationship as a man and wife, although we didn't want to bring a child into the world who may be affected, but that wasn't going to stop us having a normal married life.
In about 1985, 1986, you found out that Keith also had hepatitis C. How did that come about?
I believe it was during a consultation when one of the haematologists was involved in a research project, and so he left the room, and some papers were on the desk, and we were sat on the opposite side, and I peered over, just moved one or two, perhaps shouldn't have, I don't know, but I did, and I saw non-A, non-B, and Keith had it. And I didn't know much about hepatitis, and I was really only learning about haemophilia, to be honest. Learning a lot more. And silly me, I used to think, what do you mean? It's hepatitis A, hepatitis B. What's this non-A, non-B thing? Why don't they call it sort of hepatitis B? And if he has hepatitis B, could there be a D, E, G, A, whatever, X, Y, Z? What else is he going to pick up? That was my thinking at the time.
You've said in your statement that it came as a surprise to both of you, but you didn't question the doctor further on it, as we believed that if it was concerning, then the doctors would have spoken to us about it. We were more concerned about the HIV than the hepatitis C at the time.
And that's true. That was more overwhelming, this HIV.
In the summer of 1985, Keith had pneumonia and was very unwell with that and with oral thrush. Can you tell us about that time?
Well, the pneumonia was very debilitating. It took about 3 months of hospital care, during which time I was allowed to stay in the room with Keith. And it was quite a rest for him, really. And they could treat with whatever opportune infection came about. He was there, ready for the treatment. At home, leading up to that, he'd been on so many different antifungals, which would then affect his taste buds and his skin and his mouth. Didn't enjoy food, lost more weight. But the time on the ward, he was very well looked after.
Now, at this time, you lived in a second floor flat and you applied for some different housing. What was the reaction you received?
Very little response, actually, from the local housing authority. There's a 2-year waiting list for bungalow, or there's another big long waiting list for a ground floor apartment, and what have you. Doctor secretary, I believe she was a social worker, wrote to the local council and said, I don't know, I didn't see the letter, but it was a while after that we were given a newly decorated house with a chairlift, which was fantastic. It was a miracle, actually, because it was one of 7 homes in the local area which even had a stair lift, and they'd left it in from the previous occupants, so it was made for Keith, really.
You've described the social worker being on the back of the local authority, pestering them to give you proper accommodation.
Yes, she did. She contacted them several times.
Not very long after the move, Keith contracted pneumonia again and went back into hospital, and he was really very unwell again.
Yes.
When Keith was in hospital, you cared for him considerably, and you were regularly told you should wear gloves and at times that you should be masked as well.
Yes.
What was your reaction to that?
I refused because I cared for Keith at home. He was my husband, and as I said previously, I wasn't going to treat Keith any differently. He would feel my touch, my hands, if he needed a caress, a cuddle, some support. I was there. I wasn't going to look like a spaceman. I wasn't going to not dare touch him, because we were normal people, and he needed a normal wife to care for him, and that's what I did.
At one stage, Keith's consultant was asked by the nursing staff to tell you to bury a nurse, Keith, with masks and gloves.
Yes.
What was her response to that?
Well, by then she knew me, and she said, "Oh, he'll be all right, and she will be all right too. Just let them be." And so we were allowed to. I was allowed to be with my husband as normal.
You think that it was about 1986 that Keith was given an experimental treatment.
Yes.
What was that?
It was plasma, which was already contaminated with HIV. And I think the theory was because Keith's fighting cells and immune system was so low and so weakened, they thought if they introduced more of the contaminated plasma, it might help boost and trigger his fighting cells to then fight off other infections, and it didn't work. Didn't make any difference at all, and we were desperate. That's why we went ahead. Keith was able to think through that, and after a couple of these treatments, we decided not to go ahead because it didn't. After tests, they realised it didn't make any difference to his fighting cells and immune system.
And then in the autumn of 1986, he'd been discharged from the hospital following the pneumonia, and you went upstairs to find him vomiting blood. What happened?
It was horrendous. It was very much like a horror movie. I don't watch horror movies, but or a war movie. And at one time, he both vomited and had an accident, and both ends was blood.
The doctor came, and can you tell us what happened in relation to Keith's treatment?
Are you referring to that, or the cerebral accident?
Just when he vomited blood, the doctor came and they refused to admit him locally.
Yes, he was very angry, the doctor. Made some other phone calls and he was taken to Addenbrooke's.
The GP had tried to have him admitted in your
did.
local hospital.
Because it was such an emergency, and he needed treatment. The hospital was only about 1.5 miles away, and and the hospital wouldn't allow him to be admitted. So the doctor, Dr. Heelis, arranged for an ambulance to come and take him to Addenbrooke's instead, which was 25 miles away.
When we get to late 1986, about a year before Keith died, he started to show signs of cognitive loss. Can you tell us what that was like?
It's really difficult to say what was the worst part, because it was all dreadful. Seeing a loved one suffer. But seeing the man
the clever man I loved and married. Not being capable of being aware of his circumstances, not being able to have a conversation about, about some film director or some photographs he liked to look at, not have an opinion, not being able to remember very many things. Not having a long, not being able to remember or losing memory from about 10 minutes ago.
You've described he also had mood changes
He did.
and could be like a Jekyll and Hyde with you.
Yes, something I had never seen before, because, as I said, he was very conservative and a considerate person, and was very controlled, not giddy or flighty. Just so to see Keith get really angry or throw dishes on the floor. He didn't mean to. He just changed.
Would you like to take a break before we carry on? Or are you okay?
No, I'm okay. Yeah. So, and his mood swings were very erratic. And it was difficult to tell when he'd take a downturn. It was difficult to have a conversation, mean anything meaningful. So, yes, it was very, very difficult.
And you've described that in some of those mood swings, Keith threw dishes or food on the floor or was verbally unpleasant with you.
He was.
Throughout this time, you had a lot of support from your church community, particularly from about 1986. Can you tell us about that?
The church we joined in 86 were very, very supportive. We had at least 14 families would pray and fast one day a week. Had two other friends who would call me every day to say, what did we need? Did we need a ride somewhere? Did we need any shopping bringing in? Did we need to go out to an appointment? Do we need the dog walking or any cat food bringing in? Anything. Always calling, and they were always there, which was a saving.
And I know from our discussions your Christian faith has been important to both you and it was to Keith throughout that time.
Yes.
By 1986, you'd given up work and financially things were difficult.
Very.
So you applied for carer's allowance and you were turned down for it. Can you tell us what happened?
We were interviewed in our home by an officer who filled out the forms and looked at our application. He talked to Keith, who was having a very happy time at the time. He was very able to answer some questions, was very cheerful, if he'd talked to him the day before, it might not have been that way because of his condition and temperament, which changed. And so the officer would ask, well, how are you being cared for? And Keith would say, oh yes, everything's met, everything's taken care of, and we don't need anything. And I thought, well, ask me. He did ask me, and I did say, well, I need to be here all the time. He's becoming confused. And I didn't really like to say those things in front of Keith, but I did. I need some time. Keith needs a different face, maybe to sit with for a few hours. And tick, 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 oh well, doesn't need any. I think he must have verbally said this, because I can remember, doesn't need this allowance yet.
You were told that Keith had to be ill for 6 months to be eligible for the allowance.
Yes.
And at that point, Keith wasn't even able to get himself to the toilet.
No, he couldn't.
And Keith, in fact, died 3 months later.
He did.
Until March 1987, so from the autumn 1986 when he'd had the pneumonia till March 1987, what was Keith's condition like?
He needed 24-hour care. He didn't sleep well, and at other times he slept a lot. He was very confused mentally. Didn't know what to eat when or what to do. He would just sit. We had a kitten and a puppy. Well, by then we're 2 years old each. And he would just be content sometimes just to sit with the cat. He would quite often sleep with him in bed. If I was downstairs doing laundry or cleaning or whatever needed to be done. But his quality of life really was, it wasn't beneficial, it wasn't meaningful, it wasn't a life worth living really.
And then in March 1987, Keith fell over the threshold of the back door.
He did.
Can you tell us what happened?
Again, he was quite confused. I was playing the piano, my mum was down for a visit doing some dishes, and he'd gone out into the hallway, opened the back door, which I didn't hear, but then I heard him fall, and he mentioned about the toilet, and I figured he'd meant to go up the hallway to the downstairs toilet, and instead he'd turned right and went out of the back door and fell over, and had a really bad head wound. So then panic, call 999. Ambulance men came, they knew us by now, and they were dressed up in their space suits. Come on, Keith, we'll take you to the hospital. And I had a feeling in the back of my mind, worry, whether they were going to admit him. So I rushed upstairs to put some things together, a bag and some toiletries, in case this was another long-term stay. And they had taken him to the local hospital, which was about 1.5 miles away. So packed a few bits and pieces. By the time I got downstairs, about 30 minutes later, he was back home. And I could tell that he was in a wheelchair. He was in a mess. He had wanted the toilet and he was in a mess in his wheelchair. And the only thing the emergency department had done was put a little bit of antiseptic spray on his wound, on his head. And even the ambulancemen were very sorry to bring him back.
So you put him to bed with your mum,
Mhm.
and then your mum was watching him while you briefly went out.
I did,
And while you were out, you just had a sense that you needed to go back.
yes.
And what happened when you got back?
Just not responsive at all. And I contacted Dr. Healis. He came straight away. Keith had a little packet of jelly babies. He'd eaten some, but he wasn't well at all.
Dr. Healis said that he thought that Keith had had a stroke,
Yes,
and so he referred Keith to the hospital, to Addenbrooke's.
he did.
And it was the same ambulance crew that came
Yes.
for him.
And they took him to Addenbrooke's. I think that was the next day. He hadn't moved position in bed. Sorry, I'm trying to think of. He hadn't moved at all in bed, but he was still breathing as I felt his breath. And then, of course, Dr. Healis came and ordered for the ambulance, and it was the same ambulance man again.
And Keith never regained consciousness
He didn't.
and died on the 6th of March 1987.
Yes, he did.
After Keith died, there was a headline in the paper about his death. Can you tell us about that?
Well, just before that headline, there was an article in the paper where the local council or the local health authority were aware of this person with AIDS, and they were giving him all the help and support they could. They didn't realise, actually, my husband had already passed.
And at that stage, you weren't receiving any help from the local health authority,
No,
and they hadn't even picked up the yellow plastic bags of medical items from outside your door.
they'd actually made quite a fuss about any medical waste that Keith had in the house. And they provided the very luminous yellow plastic huge bags to put everything in. And 3 weeks after he died, they were still outside the front door, outside the back door, sorry, but people could see. And it was so stigmatising, so uncaring. And no, actually, the health authority or the local authority weren't able to help, didn't help at all. And yes, there was a headline in the paper, local man dies of AIDS, and a few innuendos and wonder what type of lifestyle they had.
And that article arose because the day before the funeral, a journalist had come to your door.
Yes, wanting some, no doubt, salacious tidbits for a newspaper. Again, thinking or wondering, did we have parties? Well, they didn't say that, but, you know, this is my mind thinking, they wanted to dig and find out the truth about this person who died of AIDS.
After Keith died, you've described immersing yourself in lots of activities to try and cope with being a young widow. One of those was to get involved in the local AIDS helpline. What was the reaction you got when you asked to be a volunteer?
They knew I was a Christian, and I think some expected me to judge, perhaps, to condemn. And actually, when I told them my story, and how my thinking had changed, and that this wasn't a punishment, these people, anybody who was sick, would need help, would need support, and we had lack of support from the authorities. So anybody in that position of need really needed people on their side.
And subsequently, you've said that the helpline made a significant difference.
They did. They were there for people who needed to call and talk to people, then who could give them contacts, who could point them in directions where they would find help. It became Stevenage AIDS helpline became quite a thing in the area. A novel idea really at the time, and there was quite a drug community in Stevenage itself who needed support.
And also in doing battle with the local authority, you've described to get people the help they needed.
Yes, absolutely.
Can you tell us what the financial impact was on you prior to Keith's death and after he died?
Well, when we first got married, we were we'd both been students, so we didn't have a great lot of money. However, when we got married, moved down south, and Keith was a lecturer, I did some too, and I also worked in a local day centre. So we had double income and no kids. And so we went on little trips abroad, here and there. In the next year, as his health declined, it meant he had to cut work hours. He couldn't manage as much. So I worked a little more to help make up any shortfalls. We didn't have any financial commitments anywhere really, other than weekly food and living costs. And as he became more poorly, he had to leave his job altogether because of the ongoing sickness and diarrhoea. Eventually, my job came to an end, and there was a job going to replace my job, which I applied for. But I prayed to God, Lord, I don't know what the answer is, whether I should be at home all the time, whether I should have money to look after Keith. So it was in his hands. I didn't get the job. My colleagues were amazed I didn't get the job. But I knew that I needed to be home with Keith. So then we were on benefits.
And it was a struggle.
It was definitely a struggle, absolutely.
You received a payment from the McFarlane Trust sometime after Keith died. Did you have to sign anything before receiving that?
I did. I had to sign a statement that said I wouldn't be involved in any future, I don't know what the wording was, but I wouldn't be involved in any litigation. Yeah, that was back in 91, I think it was, 1991.
And you also received a payment from the Skipton Fund in 2010 or 2011.
I did.
How did you come to hear about them?
Keith's brother, I was living in America at the time, and Keith's brother had contacted my dad and mentioned this Skipton Fund, and if I needed help, financial help, then I could apply for it. But I was living in America at the time, so I appointed my dad as the person to handle that affair, and legally did what I could through an attorney in America, just filling out paperwork. I couldn't get medical records, but Skipton, the team there, were very helpful. And yes, I was awarded a payment.
Now, as far as you're aware, Keith wasn't offered any counselling or psychological support throughout his illness, and neither were you until about 6 months after Keith's death.
Mm.
It's right that about 6 months after his death, your widow's allowance had come to an end.
It did.
And you've described it as being wiped out and very distraught. And it was only at that point that you were offered some counselling.
Yes, it was. Yeah, I'd had friends in church, but as far as sort of professional help and counselling, that didn't come till much later at that time.
And it was only because you sought it out and your GP was proactive.
Yes, I actually collapsed. A nurse friend, we sat and talked a little bit, and I broke down.
And you've described that process as feeling like walking through a blackberry bush and being torn.
It was. Yeah.
Those are the questions I have for you. Is there anything else you would like to say?
Well, we did have an awful lot of support in other ways, day-to-day support, for which I am extremely grateful, especially to Dr. Healis, who still is practising in Letchworth. He's a very caring doctor. I saw him cry at Keith's demise, especially when he said Keith had had a stroke. He cried. The ambulance station, which was about half a mile from where we lived, and the people who came to take Keith to hospital various times. Our friends in church. It's were there on the phone, at the end of the phone, or even in the house. The prayer team, our pastor, a very caring man, and the church body, really. Had it not been for those people, I think Keith's care would have suffered, because I wouldn't have been upheld myself. I wouldn't have been supported as well. I'm very grateful to those people.
I'm just going to turn and ask Mr. Snowden, who, as you know, represents you, if there's any points he wishes me to raise. He has nothing else.
Well, there is something I'd like to ask. Did you write a book?
I did.
And what was it called?
Stigma, an AIDS widow's story.
In 1989, was that?
It was.
And what were you wanting to say in that book?
It was really to say that people going through this situation, there was hope, and there is hope. There's a God who cares. So it was very much from our Christian point of view, and he is a compassionate God, and we had to have hope, and we did have hope, and I did too, and I still do. And it was to help other people in a similar situation who might not have had a faith, but who might have reached out to people of a faith in God, to find support in people in a caring community.
And when you called it Stigma, an AIDS widow's story, what was the stigma that you had in mind particularly?
Collectively, I think you could put it all in a big yellow plastic medical refuse bag. That was the stigma.
Well, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
Thank you for your quiet and calm courage.
Thank you.
There's no rush. You can stay there or you can sit back where you came from, as you wish. Well, Ms. Fraser-Butlin, that's the end of the witness evidence that we have for today.
It is.
And tomorrow we start at 10:30. And who are we due to hear from? There is a change, is there not, to tomorrow's published programme?
There is.
For reasons I spoke about briefly this morning.
The witnesses we'll be hearing from are Martin Beard, David Gort and Darren Rawson.
So it's David Gort who is taking what had been the time in which we had hoped to hear from Mr. Ahern.
That's correct, sir.
Well, I'm sure everyone here will understand the reason for the change and sympathise with Mr. Ahern at this moment. Just remains for me to say thank you, and I look forward to seeing as many of you as wish to come tomorrow, 10:30.